Chapter 29 of Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Davis. Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Chapter 29, Conclusion. The ship was the Principe Umberto, bound from Callao to Genoa. She had carried a number of immigrants to Rio, had gone thence to Callao, where she had taken in a cargo of guano, and was now on her way home. The captain was a certain Giovanni Gianni, a native of Sestri. He has kindly allowed me to refer to him in case the truth of my story should be disputed, but I grieve to say that I suffered him to mislead himself in some important particulars. I should add that when we were picked up we were 1,000 miles from land. As soon as we were on board, the captain began questioning us about the siege of Paris, from which city he had assumed that we must have come, notwithstanding our immense distance from Europe. As may be supposed, I had not heard a syllable about the war between France and Germany, and was too ill to do more than assent to all that he chose to put into my mouth. My knowledge of Italian is very imperfect, and I gathered little from anything that he said, but I was glad to conceal the true point of our departure, and resolved to take any cue that he chose to give me. The line that thus suggested itself was that there had been 10 or 12 others in the balloon, that I was an English milord, and Erewhina a Russian countess, that all the others had been drowned, and that the dispatches which we had carried were lost. I came afterwards to learn that this story would not have been credible had not the captain been for some weeks at sea, for I found that when we were picked up, the Germans had already long been masters of Paris. As it was, the captain settled the whole story for me, and I was well content. In a few days we sighted an English vessel bound from Melbourne to London with wool. At my earnest request, in spite of stormy weather which rendered it dangerous for a boat to take us from one ship to the other, the captain consented to signal the English vessel, and we were received on board, but we were transferred with such difficulty that no communication took place as to the manner of our being found. I did indeed hear the Italian mate who was in charge of the boat shout out something in French to the effect that we had been picked up from a balloon, but the noise of the wind was so great, and the captain understood so little French that he caught nothing of the truth, and it was assumed that we were two persons who had been saved from shipwreck. When the captain asked me in what ship I had been wrecked, I said that a party of us had been carried out to sea in a pleasure boat by a strong current, and that Erewhina, whom I described as a Peruvian lady, and I were alone saved. There were several passengers, whose goodness towards us we can never repay. I grieve to think that they cannot fail to discover that we did not take them fully into our confidence. But had we told them all, they would not have believed us, and I was determined that no one should hear of Erewhon, or have the chance of getting there before me, as long as I could prevent it. Indeed, the recollection of the many falsehoods which I was then obliged to tell would render my life miserable were I not sustained by the consolations of my religion. Among the passengers there was a most estimable clergyman, by whom Erewhina and I were married within a very few days of our coming on board. After a prosperous voyage of about 2 months, we sighted the Land's End, and in another week we were landed at London. A liberal subscription was made for us on board the ship, so that we found ourselves in no immediate difficulty about money. I accordingly took Erewhina down into Somersetshire, where my mother and sisters had resided when I last heard of them. To my great sorrow, I found that my mother was dead, and that her death had been accelerated by the report of my having been killed, which had been brought to my employer's station by Chowbok. It appeared that he must have waited for a few days to see whether I returned, that he then considered it safe to assume that I should never do so, and had accordingly made up a story about my having fallen into a whirlpool of seething waters while coming down the gorge homeward. Search was made for my body, but the rascal had chosen to drown me in a place where there would be no chance of its ever being recovered. My sisters were both married, but neither of their husbands was rich. No one seemed overjoyed on my return, and I soon discovered that when a man's relations have once mourned for him as dead, they seldom like the prospect of having to mourn for him a second time. Accordingly, I returned to London with my wife, and through the assistance of an old friend, supported myself by writing good little stories for the magazines and for a tract society. I was well paid, and I trust that I may not be considered presumptuous in saying that some of the most popular of the brochures which are distributed in the streets and which are to be found in the waiting rooms of the railway stations, have proceeded from my pen. During the time that I could spare, I arranged my notes and diary till they assumed their present shape. There remains for me nothing to add, save to unfold the scheme which I proposed for the conversion of Erewhon. That scheme has only been quite recently decided upon as the one which seems the most likely to be successful. It will be seen at once that it would be madness for me to go with 10 or a dozen subordinate missionaries by the same way as that which led me to discover Erewhon. I should be imprisoned for typhus, besides being handed over to the straighteners for having run away with Arowhena. An even darker fate, to which I dare hardly again allude, would be reserved for my devoted fellow labourers. It is plain, therefore, that some other way must be found for getting at the Erewhonians, and I am thankful to say that such another way is not wanting. One of the rivers which descends from the snowy mountains and passes through Erewhon is known to be navigable for several hundred miles from its mouth. Its upper waters have never yet been explored, but I feel little doubt that it will be found possible to take a light gunboat, for we must protect ourselves, to the outskirts of the Erewhonian country. I propose, therefore, that one of those associations should be formed in which the risk of each of its members is confined to the amount of his stake in the concern. The first step would be to draw up a prospectus. In this I would advise that no mention should be made of the fact that the Erewhonians are the lost tribes. The discovery is one of absorbing interest to myself, but it is of sentimental rather than commercial value, and business is business. The capital to be raised should not be less than £50,000, and might be either in 5 or 10 pound shares as hereafter determined. This should be amply sufficient for the expenses of an experimental voyage. When the money had been subscribed, it would be our duty to charter a steamer of some 12 or 1400 tons burden, and with accommodation for a cargo of steerage passengers. She should carry 2 or 3 guns in case of her being attacked by savages at the mouth of the river. Boats of considerable size should be also provided, and I think it would be desirable that these also should carry 2 or 3 6-pounders. The ship should be taken up the river as far as was considered safe, and a picked party should then ascend in the boats. The presence of both Arowhena and myself would be necessary at this stage, inasmuch as our knowledge of the language would disarm suspicion and facilitate negotiations. We should begin by representing the advantages afforded to labour in the colony of Queensland, and point out to the Erewhonians that by emigrating thither they would be able to amass, each and all of them, enormous fortunes, a fact which would be easily provable by a reference to statistics. I have no doubt that a very great number might be thus induced to come back with us in the larger boats, and that we could fill our vessel with emigrants in 3 or 4 journeys. Should we be attacked, our course would be even simpler, for the Erewhonians have no gunpowder, and would be so surprised with its effects that we should be able to capture as many as we chose. In this case, we should feel able to engage them on more advantageous terms, for they would be prisoners of war. But even though we were to meet with no violence, I doubt not that a cargo of 700 or 800 Erewhonians could be induced, when they were once on board the vessel, to sign an agreement which should be mutually advantageous both to us and them. We should then proceed to Queensland and dispose of our engagement with the Erewhonians to the sugar growers of that settlement, who are in great want of labour. It is believed that the money thus realized would enable us to declare a handsome dividend, and leave a considerable balance which might be spent in repeating our operations and bringing over other cargoes of Erewhonians, with fresh consequent profits. In fact, we could go backwards and forwards as long as there was a demand for labour in Queensland, or indeed in any other Christian colony, for the supply of Erewhonians would be unlimited, and they could be packed closely and fed at a very reasonable cost. It would be my duty and Arowhena's to see that our immigrants should be boarded and lodged in the households of religious sugar growers. These persons would give them the benefit of that instruction whereof they stand so greatly in need. Each day, as soon as they could be spared from their work in the plantations, they would be assembled for praise, and be thoroughly grounded in the church catechism, while the whole of every Sabbath should be devoted to singing psalms and church-going. This must be insisted upon, both in order to put a stop to any uneasy feeling which might show itself either in Queensland or in the mother country as to the means whereby the Erewhonians have been obtained, and also because it would give our own shareholders the comfort of reflecting that they were saving souls and filling their own pockets at one